from the News Channel 5 network. This is Inside Politics.
Hello, everyone. I'm News Channel 5's political analyst, Pat Nolan. Welcome to Inside Politics. Most American presidents begin their term with high numbers in the public opinion polls, and they experience a political honeymoon. But eventually that comes to an end, as it has for President Biden in the last couple of months. To discuss how and why that's happened and what it means for the upcoming midterm elections and the rest of President Biden's term, welcome back to Inside Politics this week, Dr. Thomas Schwartz, Distinguished Professor of History and Political Science at Vanderbilt University. Dr. Schwartz, it's always great to have you on the program. We look forward to having you here. Thanks for joining us.
Well, thank you very much for having me on the program.
Despite the false charges that the 2020 presidential election was rigged, President Joe Biden began his term with polling numbers well above 50%. In the early months, the COVID vaccines got out successfully. Things seemed to be moving back towards normal, but then came the Delta variant and a new surge in cases, hospitalizations, and deaths. Presidents get the blame or credit for anything that happens on their watch, but is it fair to blame the President and the Biden administration for not doing more to deal with the Delta variant?
Well, I think the first thing to say is politics isn't fair, and you're quite right. Presidents get the blame for what happens on their watch. I think the only thing that can be said, and I don't think it's fair, obviously, it's a disease, it's not something politicians can control. The one thing I think that is difficult is that Biden and his administration really declared victory a little too soon. They were probably more optimistic than they needed to be in May about dropping regulations and the rest, and they might have proceeded a little more cautiously. That would be my major criticism there, that it was more a case of wanting to declare victory and reap the benefits of that, and perhaps not being cautious enough about the potential.
Did the president also underestimate the strength and impact of the still sizable minority of Americans who've been both skeptical and in many cases downright opposed to taking shots?
He may have, yes. I think that's something that you can see in American history. Americans are an ornery lot, especially when it comes to governments telling them what to do. And even with the pandemic and the way it was, you're going to get resistance. This vaccine, the issues of surrounding coronavirus were politicized from the very beginning with the Trump administration. And so it was no doubt that you were going to get a fair amount of resistance. And so perhaps he did also, in his administration, did underestimate the degree of difficulty they'd have convincing people.
There are lots of signs that the virus is easing again. Perhaps by next spring, some say we'll be getting back to normal, at least close to it again. Does that mean this issue will kind of go away and not hurt the president anymore? Or is there going to be a lingering effect because people voted for Joe Biden because they thought he was competent and maybe they thought he let them down?
I think it's more likely this issue will simply fade. I don't think it'll be a huge part of the indictment of Biden compared, say, for example, with Afghanistan, where it was much more directly something that he was involved in. I think this issue, especially if we get back to a sort of sense of normalcy, simply won't hurt him. It probably won't help him a great deal, although I'm sure the Democrats will try to campaign on the idea that they were able to cope with the pandemic. But I just have the feeling that it's not going to be as huge a plus, but it won't be also a huge negative either.
The uneven recovery of the economy has also become an issue, particularly with historically high rates of inflation. The administration says they also too think that's beginning to ease, but is it, when all is said and done, it may be the biggest issue for voters is what James Carville said in his famous statement, it's the economy, stupid, it's not the one that's going to count next year?
Yeah, the interesting thing is, of course, Carville said that after a recession in which unemployment was a bigger issue and the slowdown of the economy. But I think if you actually look historically, the 1970s, the period of high inflation, was a period of great political volatility with one-term presidents in the sense that inflation, rather than unemployment certainly hits a lot of people, but inflation hits everyone. And in a sense, it is a much more universal issue, and it can be, I think, far more dangerous and devastating for a political party if they get tagged with the idea that they're not doing enough against inflation. So I think it is perhaps very something that the Biden administration is going to have to be very, very careful about how it treats.
There's a lot of issues that also involved in the economy right now. There's certainly supply chain delivery problems and a shortage of workers. Is there anything a president can really do about that? I mean, these appear to be, in some cases, international situations and also situations of just societal change. People don't want to go back to the jobs they used to have, especially at the wages they were being paid before.
Yeah, I don't think there's a great deal the president can do. One of the things he can do is position himself on the idea of bringing more of the supply chains back under the United States sovereignty. In effect, being more nationalistic about our economy, trying to encourage more manufacturing in the United States so that supply chain disruptions that might be caused by issues of the pandemic, for example, in other countries would be minimized. So I think he could use this in part to emphasize a sort of Buy American, Build in America type program. And that might help him at least appear to be doing something about what is a very intractable problem and does reflect, I think, as you correctly stated, a lot of societal change.
You mentioned Afghanistan earlier. A lot of these problems, we were also talking about the economy and with COVID, were out there, but they didn't all seem to galvanize and begin to drive the president's poll numbers down until he did the withdrawal from Afghanistan. Did they not realize, and do they still not realize how disastrous that was, particularly in terms of the optics that came out of it, the pictures and the other things that have been coming on ever since then?
I confess to some wonderment on that. I think this is partly because the president was so convinced he was right, and this goes back a ways with Joe Biden because he lost the debate in the Obama administration and believed he had been right then that we should have withdrawn. But I think his sheer conviction on that he did the right thing with that, and that will be vindicated by history, has overcome, you might say, the optics and the other issues that some of his political advisors probably did realize. And I think that sense that the president is so deeply invested in the rightness of this decision, despite the fact it was carried out chaotically and ineffectively, I think that makes it harder for the Biden administration or the White House to fully appreciate it. I think they're just hoping it'll go away.
A few presidents outside of George Herbert Walker Bush had more foreign policy experience when they already came into the office. I think I hear you saying that perhaps that experience may have blinded him to the situation that was going to happen, and maybe he didn't want to see what was going to happen to him. And of course, then there's what the generals told him or didn't tell him and what they advised or didn't advise. That's still an issue on Capitol Hill, and a bipartisan one.
Yes. Yeah, no, the generals testified that they had advised him on keeping troops there and that this was really the president's decision. And I think he had an odd reading of history. He thought that Nixon and Kissinger had gotten away with their withdrawal from Vietnam without realizing that it had damaged Kissinger. Certainly then, Nixon was already out of office. He had an odd reading of history about Vietnam, and I think that led him to underestimate the political risks of a chaotic and poorly planned withdrawal from Afghanistan, despite the public opinion polls that showed Americans seemed to want out of Afghanistan. I don't think his judgment was very good in this regard.
Dr. Thomas Schwartz at Vanderbilt University, a history and political science professor there, is our guest on Inside Politics. We're talking about the problems and challenges facing President Joe Biden less than 1 year into his term. Back to continue our conversation after this break.